Testing, testing. There we are. Yes.
Can you hear me too? Yeah.
Yes, maybe this is our nation's great transition. As Valerie Carr said, we're living in a very difficult time, as we've been hearing the last 3 days. From all over the world, we have human rights activists from 31 countries, from every region, that have come together to really consult together. What do we do in these difficult times? How do we breathe and push? How do we push forward together? So it is our honor and privilege to have with us tonight two of America's most admired leaders. For a conversation about how do we stand again for human rights in the world? How does America, as imperfect as it is when it comes to human rights, bring back human rights to the centerpiece of our lives? I'd like to start with you, President Carter, a question for you. If you could just summarize what you've heard today, where are we and what do we need to do now?
Well, I think the best comment I heard today that summarizes it was that we are struggling now to keep going what we achieved in the past. We've slipped backwards in human rights all over the world. And one of the key reasons is that other countries that used to use the United States of America as kind of a beacon light of truth and human rights and justice and freedom no longer can see us as a beacon light of hope and about the future. And quite often a government that's inclined to violate human rights, when they see the United States abandon that as one of our key elements of foreign policy, they say, well, it's okay for us to do it now. So I think we've seen the entire world slip backward, in effect, in honoring and promoting and championing and fighting for human rights and holding it as a key guide for all of us.
Yes. Senator Sanders, how do you see this problem now going forward as America hopes to really be a leader on human rights? We're in a difficult time. What would you say is our priority now?
Before I respond to that, let me just express my joy at being here at the Carter Center with a man who not only is respected by the vast majority of the people of our country, those who may agree with him politically and those who disagree, but who has lived his life, and Mrs. Carter and Amy, with incredible dignity, so that we are all so proud of what you have achieved as president and after president. So I'm just delighted to be here. Let me answer your question by saying I'm not, I think, going to say anything that will shock anybody in this room. I don't think the leadership of this country today, in fact, believes very strongly in human rights. That's not what they believe in. We are in a new moment, in a pivotal moment in American history. We have a president, and again, I don't mean to be disrespectful to anybody, least of all the president, but he is, in contrast to the gentleman here, we have a president who lies all of the time. And it is very hard to deal. I don't mind people disagree. You know, we may disagree. People disagree with each other. It's called democracy. I'm often asked, well, what did you think about what President Trump said yesterday? And it's hard to answer because his view will be different tomorrow. And you know, very often factually, what he says is just not correct. And when you talk about human rights, it's important that we do not allow the normalization of a situation in which a president basically says that all of the media in this country, you know, New York Times, the Washington Post, a whole lot of them. Believe me, I have problems with the media. But to suggest that all of the media are providing fake news, and that really the only person in America, the only source of information that we can get, that we can trust, comes from the tweets of President Trump. How crazy is that? And then you have attacks on the judiciary, so-called judges who disagree with the decision. Thank God that they ruled against some of his executive orders. And then you have him with a very positive relationship with Mr. Putin, who has moved his country into a very authoritarian direction, as well as other global leaders who, in fact, do not particularly believe in democracy. So that is where I see us today.
And how do you both explain the rise of authoritarianism? Where's this coming from?
Well, I think the root of it is something that I haven't heard discussed much. I told a group today that in 1999, at the end of the last millennium, in the beginning of 2000, I was asked to make speeches in Oslo, Norway, and also in Taiwan. And my subject was, what is the greatest challenge to be faced by the next century? And I said the disparity between rich people and poor people. And I think that is the case not only between people who live in a country, but also between nations. And I believe that the root of a downturn in human rights preceded 2016. It began earlier than that. And I think the reason was the disparity in income, which has been translated into the average person, good, decent, hardworking, middle-class people feeling that they are getting cheated by the government and by society. And they don't get the same element of health care. They don't get the same quality education. They don't get the same political rights, particularly after the stupid decision of the Supreme Court on Citizens United, where they said that it's an unlimited amount of money going into campaigns. But now they feel that even in politics, their choice of a candidate to be president or governor or congressman or whoever is not the same as a rich person's. And also, once that candidate gets in office, if he's successful, quite often the average person feels that they are repaying their contributions with legal bribery, and it's legal. And the justice system has also gone down. Long before we had this last election, when I left the White House, for instance, 1 out of 1,000 people were in prison. Now, 7 people out of 1,000 are in prison. 7 times as many people who are Americans are now in prison as they were just when I left the White House. So the feeling of an average person that I'll be treated fairly by the justice system is missing. So, basic human rights, income, status in society, health care, education, participation in politics, justice, the things in which we used to have complete faith now have been distorted by the rich people getting richer and the poor people getting poorer. And when the rich people get a candidate in office, they can be sure that the tax laws and everything else are going to keep them getting richer and richer, but the average person suffers. So I think that dissatisfaction with the existing system of politics resulted in the outcome of the election in 2016 in the United States. People were willing just to take a chance and to abandon democracy and what we know about is basic principles and try something new, no matter what it was.
One of our participants, Maina Kiai, said market fundamentalism is the driving force behind this. What do you think, Senator Sanders? How do you explain the rise of authoritarianism?
I agree with everything that President Carter said. Look, here is the situation. You got all over this country tens of millions of people who are extremely angry and they are disappointed. Now, we all know that as a result of technology, workers are producing more today than they did 20 or 30 years ago. And yet, despite that, you're seeing people working not 40 hours a week, they're working 50 or 60 hours a week. Their wages are actually going down. Now, how would you feel if you were a 50-year-old man or woman working at a factory and you went to work one day and somebody said, oh, by the way, our company can make more money by going to China, good luck to you, and you go out and you got a job at half the wages you formerly made? How do you feel as a parent when you know that your kid, who you love so much and you want better things than you had, that's the American dream, your kid can't afford to go to college, can't even find a home for himself or herself, or maybe leave school $50,000, $80,000 in debt. So I think President Carter is right. I think if you're going to look at human rights, we have got to look the term I use is the growth of oligarchy in America.
That's right. That's it.
Oligarchy. And what that means, and the president touched on both of the issues, it's not just an unbelievably grotesque level of income and wealth inequality. One family in America owns more wealth than the bottom 42%, et cetera. But these guys are not putting their money under their mattress. They are using it politically. So we live in a country where people fought and died for democracy, and you got the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and a handful of billionaires able to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to elect candidates who will represent the wealthy and the powerful. And this recent bill, everybody is familiar with this terrible bill that was passed last Thursday in the House. The media describes it as a health care bill. It's not a health care bill. It is a bill designed to give $300 billion in tax breaks to the top 2% and hundreds of billions more to the drug companies and the insurance companies. So that's what you got. The rich get richer. They protect themselves politically. They get more tax breaks. The middle class shrinks. Some people in this country live in desperate poverty. And then, in the midst of all of that frustration and that anger and the pain, you got somebody who comes along and says, you know what the source of your problem is? It's that Muslim over there. It's the Latino over there. You're supposed to hate that person. And I think that has a lot to do in this country and internationally with a lot of what we are seeing today.
Yes.
Karen, I'm relieved to know that Senator Sanders agrees with me. I feel much more sure about what I said now that she was But the thing is, how does it affect other countries, the ones that are assembled here?
Yes, and of course the rise of the neoliberal economic orthodoxy that we have lived within for, how many decades now, that we have been told, the rising tide would lift all boats, has failed. Right. So how do we, and we heard many testimonies today about, about this problem, from the Congo to Pakistan, everywhere. So, as the United States exerts its influence in the world and we take a broader view of human rights, it is political rights, these are interlinked. Because we see in our country, just as you're describing this, the police are expanding their powers. When people protest what you're talking about, we have increasing prison populations. We have a militarization of the police using military equipment to control the protests. We have our Atlanta leader of the Black Lives Matter movement here, Khalid Kamau. So we see all over the country Standing Rock. Ruth Ann Buffalo is here from Standing Rock. There is a rising movement, but these are interlinked. So when these policies leave people behind and people rise up, even in the United States, we heard today from India a heartbreaking testimony that even in the last 2 or 3 years, what we think of India as a great democracy, that is going away. You can't even protest anymore. So we see the linkages between this. So how can we use our influence in the world for you both? This question is for you both. President Carter, you put human rights at the center of our foreign policy. It was a difficult time. It was the Cold War. It was not easy to do that. Right. And Senator Sanders, you are in the Senate. You have the one of 100 seats of really where the only power is left in this country, apart from the very courageous federal courts, I must say. Our courts are standing up for human rights. But how do we get the United States to face its own problems, but then become a leader again?
Why don't you go first this time?
Gee, I was just copying what you were saying. This makes it more difficult. Look, this is what I think. The bottom line is that I don't think the real change that we need is going to take place in the U.S. Senate or in Washington. It's going to take place in what our very brave guests here are doing all over the world. It's going to take place at the grassroots level, from one end of this country to the other. And what I mean by that, and as I have said many times, I don't mean to get into intricacies of American politics. I think in many ways, Donald Trump did not win the election. The Democratic Party lost the election. And that means we have got to revitalize the Democratic Party, make it a grassroots party, bring together black workers and white workers and Latino workers and Asian American and Native American workers. I think we can do that. I have spent a lot of my time recently not going just to blue states, but going to conservative states. Because if you go to states like Kansas, or you go to states like Nebraska, which are both very strongly Republican states, and you ask people, do you believe that it makes sense to give tax breaks to billionaires and cut back on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? People look at you like you're crazy. Of course we don't believe in that. So our job is to go into 50 states in this country to bring people together around a progressive agenda, which has the courage to do what Democrats historically have not had the courage to do. Point out, there is Wall Street, there is the insurance companies, there are the drug companies, there are the fossil fuel industry. These are the people who are ripping us off, and these are the people who are donating money to candidates who represent their interests and not the interest of the middle class and working people of this country. So I think we need to revitalize American democracy. We have one of the lowest voter turnouts of any major country on earth. Some of you may have noticed that a few weeks ago, in the French election, the first election, almost 80% of the French people voted. If we had 80% of the people voting in this country, the Republican Party would be a significant minority. All right? So we have got to get people involved. And you do that by being honest about the real problems they face and come up with real solutions.
Can you all see why I voted for him? Well, I think the thing that we need to discuss is the trend downward and the things in which we have faith and on which we can depend. We used to have faith in democracy. We used to have faith in the truth. We used to have faith in our fellow human citizens. We used to have faith in our public officials. But we've basically lost that element of faith. I quoted my high school teacher this morning when I made her speech. She said, we must accommodate changing times, and that we are in the midst of changing times, but we must cling to principles that never change. And one of those principles is the truth and freedom. And I quoted also Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. 2 of them are positive. One is freedom of speech. Another is freedom of religion. 2 of them are negative. Freedom from want and freedom from fear. And I think now permeating the entire world of freedom, or the lack of freedoms to combat want because of a disparity in income that I pointed out, which is getting worse every year, and also freedom from fear. We still have that, there's a long way to go. In some cases, we still have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Some are overwhelmingly religious one way or the other. So we have freedom of religion, but sometimes it's constrained. But anyway, we still have that big obstacle to overcome. One of the things that we need to do now is to see how this small group of courageous human rights heroes can add their contributions of thought and experiences together and form a tight coalition in this small group, and then expand it to Washington. And some of you are going to be going up there to meet with members of the Senate and the House, and maybe some parts of the administration. I don't know about that yet. And then expand it to as much as we can to the world, but never give up. And united together, which I hope we will be, just being champions of human rights and freedom and a lack of fear and a lack of want, I think our voice can be greatly expanded on a global basis even. So this little tiny drop of people here compared to the rest of the world can have a great influence if we speak together and forcefully and courageously.
And Senator Sanders, President Carter just opened the door for me to not let you off the hook that easily, because you are in the Senate. Yes, we have a people's movement for sure, but you have a very, very huge platform from which you can speak. We heard today from Anna Savortian from Russia about the danger of silence, that we have to speak about what's going on around the world. We have to give voice and highlight this regression of human rights that's happening globally, even in our own country. I know that there are members of the Senate, your own colleagues, who are looking at ways the Senate can, bring the power of the Senate. After Vietnam, we had the Church Committee that made important reforms in the CIA. Could we see something come? I realize that it's an uphill battle right now with this administration, but we have to think ahead. Can we rely on the Leahy Amendment, for example, to challenge military assistance to some of the countries where our friends are coming from, Nigeria, Kenya, that are receiving military assistance? This is something the United States could do, isn't it?
Theoretically, it could, but those of us who believe in those values are in a minority. But it is important, as the President just said, that even though we may be in the minority, that our voices have got to be loud and clear. The United States should not be funding military dictatorships around the world, should not be giving support to leaders who torture and imprison thousands of their people. And somebody has got to, and what is very, very sad, and again, the President made this point, there was once a time in our lifetimes, not 200 years ago, where when people thought about the United States, they did believe this is a country of freedom, this is a country of opportunity, this is the country in the world that believes in truth. And it is very, very, very sad to see that the values that we once were respected for all over the world are now being diminished, especially in the last few months.
Well, we will be, a small group of us will be in Washington, D.C. later this week, and we'll be meeting with a few senators. We'll be seeing Senator Corker.
We're going to meet with Bob Corker, for instance,
Yeah.
who's a Republican from
Bob is
nearby Tennessee, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
Yeah, no
We
problem.
know it's an uphill battle. I think that we have to give voice to these issues. Last year, we talked a lot about diverting the resources from the machinery of war into the machinery of peace, and into the machinery of human rights, which is in front of us. Do you see any opportunities, Senator Sanders, to really raise this we know that there is a new budget coming up. The President has asked for an increase in military expenditures. Is there any chance for the people to be heard to question that?
The answer is, of course. I mean, if you think about what needs to be done, then look at the Trump budget, and it's exactly the opposite of where we should be going. All right? In other words, can you imagine, at a time when we need to focus on diplomacy, at a time when poor people all over the world must know, or should know, that the United States is their ally, that we are there to help them with food, we are there to help them with education, with new technology. We are their allies. What President Trump wants to do is substantially reduce foreign aid, substantially reduce the staffing in the State Department, but add $80 billion more to the military on top of a already very, very bloated military budget. And then domestically, having done that, he wants to take that money, that $80 billion that he's spending on the military, by cutting Head Start, by cutting Pell Grants, by cutting the WIC program for low-income pregnant women and children, cutting the Meals on Wheels program, which provides nutritious meals to low-income seniors. In other words, doing exactly the opposite. And our job right now, and I am working on it, almost 24/7, is to go around this country and tell the American people, are those your priorities? More money for the defense. Already we're spending more than the next 12 nations, and there's tremendous waste within the Department of Defense. Do we need more while we're cutting domestic programs? Do we need not to be supporting poor people around the world rather than leaving them prey to terrorist ideologies?
President Carter, last year we talked at our forum about the new generation of nuclear weapons. Do you think this $1 trillion that we're about to spend is the wise use of resources?
Of course not. Well, I don't think there's any way for anyone, even in your own personal mind, to separate peace from human rights. Because one of the basic elements of peace, of human rights, is to be living at peace. And only then can you have other human rights, like freedom of speech and religion, and also a chance to have an income and an education and health care and a house to live in and things of that kind. And when war comes, the abuses of human rights, which we all know about and for which we've talked for the last 3 years about, the number one human rights abuse, that is women and girls, that becomes much more serious. Every human right that we talk about and is listed in the 30 Principles of Human Rights are exacerbated or made worse under the cloud of war. When a nation decides to go to war, they basically drop any feeling of love or the absence of hatred or aversion to killing. And the United States has been at war almost full time since the Second World War. We've been at war now with about 30 different nations. Only 4 years we didn't go to have any conflict, and I won't say which 4 years that was. But we not only had human rights but peace, and I think the two are inseparable. So we need to do what we can to let the United Nations honor its basic commitment and its basic purpose, that is to preserve peace in the world. And the United States can do its part if it ever will. But I think now we're moving more toward a military attitude. And this derives not just from politicians, not just from the military industry who manufacture weapons, but it derives from the attitude of American people who forget about the fact that we are a nation of peace, and most of us in the United States are Christians. We worship the Prince of Peace, not the Prince of War. And we're supposed to reach out and understand each other and not hate each other. Well, I thought that's a basic principle, again, that we need to remind ourselves about, and that is connecting peace always as human rights. And that's the two things that the Carter Center tries to concentrate on without deviation. Promoting peace when there was a choice, and human rights. And sometimes neither one of those things are very popular.
Yes, and since 9/11, we have put ourselves in a permanent war frame, on a permanent footing for war. The Bush administration started us on that path, and thank goodness President Obama did avoid war with Iran, and he normalized relations with Cuba. These were two fantastic, wonderful developments. But at the same time, he didn't really change the basic framework with which we're dealing. On 9/11, there was a very small piece of territory where you could find Al-Qaeda on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Very small, a handful of guys. Now the ideology is spread globally, so it obviously hasn't worked. And just as we're closing, we only have a few more minutes, any thoughts about how can we get out of this mindset? You said the public. We've got to change the minds of the American people that this is actually a pathway that's going to lead to more security. How do we do that? How do we get the American people to see that investing in peace and human rights is a better investment and it will make them more secure? Senator Sanders, what advice do you have for us?
Well, just 2 points. We do have, going back to somebody who preceded President Carter by a few years, is Dwight D. Eisenhower. You all remember what he said in his farewell remarks, and that is beware, in so many words, of the military-industrial complex. And if you think the military-industrial complex was strong when he left in 1960, it is far, far stronger today. Do not kid yourself. When we expand military spending and when we develop new weapon systems, there are corporations that are making huge amounts of money, many billions of dollars in profits. The oversight of these defense contractors is minimal. Often they tell you they will do a weapon system for X dollars, and it ends up being 2 or 3 times X because of massive overruns, a lot of corruption going on there. I think I would get back to the point that I made earlier, but what this country is hungering for is a vision which says, no, we're not going to spend $700 billion a year on the military when we have veterans sleeping out on the street, when kids can't afford to go to college, when 28 million people have no health insurance, when there are senior citizens trying to make it on $13,000 a year Social Security. We need a vision that talks about an America which works for all people, which involves people. I do not want to see this country continuing as we did in 2014, the elections. Almost 2/3 of the American people didn't vote. They're giving up. They don't believe their voices matter. So I think all of these things, there is, what I've learned in politics is everything is related to everything is related to everything. You can't siloize these things. We have to revitalize American democracy. We got to get people active, standing up for themselves and their kids, prepared to take on very powerful, big money interests. But we need a progressive agenda that will, in fact, speak to the needs of the working people of this country.
There's one other thing that I'd like to add. I know we're doing about out of time, but that is that a lot of people think it's a choice between security on the one hand and human rights on the other. But the best way to have a country secure is to honor human rights. They're tied together, and I think that's one of the basic messages we can put forward. If the United States goes for human rights and freedom and equality, it's the best way to avoid a lack of security. It makes our country stronger at home. It makes our country stronger on a global basis as well. So we should remember that human rights and security are tied together. If a people want to live securely, let them honor human rights. And that choice ought not to be a divided thing in politics, which it often is. Because the conservatives, many of the Republican candidates say, when you go to those weak things like peace and human rights, you're abandoning American security. It's just the opposite.
And we talked about that a lot here this week, is that we've got to do a better job of explaining to the public that these things go together. Senator Sanders, were you going to say something?
I just was thinking in my own mind when we talk about freedom from fear, that it is not just being black in this country and walking the streets and being afraid of being picked up or shot by a police officer, but also increasingly, and this is just a whole discussion above and beyond everything we're doing today, is the kind of surveillance that exists through information technology. I mean, the fact that, you know, there are resources and nobody knows exactly what's going on, but we have reason to believe that the government can easily track anything that you read on the internet. Any email that you send can get into your phone calls, and corporate America knows more about your purchasing habits than you know. And we see that, and I think in the year 2017, there's no question to my mind that we are moving toward a surveillance type of society, and we need public policy to confront that exploding technology.
That's right.
We're going to wind up now. Senator Sanders has agreed to take some questions, but President Carter needs to leave right at 7. Is there anything that we've left unsaid that you want to ask each other?
If there's a hard question, ask him before he goes.
We save it for tomorrow.
Thank you, President Carter, for being with us. Senator
By the
Sanders is
way,
going to
the
stay
reason
with
I
us.
didn't wear a tie, I can't tie a tie. I got one sore hand. By the way, my wrist is healing up quite well. I told you I'd explain that to you today, and I want to do it. Thank you very much again.
Wonderful to see you. Okay. Thank you.
Now, we have some microphones that are set up for you to, if you want to pull the microphones out to the front here, so people can come and ask questions. So if you want to ask a question of Senator Sanders, come right up to these microphones back here, and we're grateful to you. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, where are they? Somebody wave and show people where to line up. I can't see, the lights are too bright. Okay, stand up and go to the microphones. I was going over there. It's hard to see. Is there someone there? I see Doug Rutson. Introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Doug Rutson from the International Center for Nonprofit Law. Senator Sanders, you talked about folks who have to work 50 or 60 hours a week. Their income is declining. They don't have health care, and they have endemic poverty. How would you explain to a U.S. citizen in that circumstance why it's important to invest internationally in human rights?
Well, because at the end of the day, and in fact, at the end of the day, if all that we do is grow a military and engage in wars all over the world, from simply, forget the morality and the humanity of it, from a dollars and cents perspective, that is a very, very expensive proposition, which takes us right back to Trump's budget of $80 billion more for the military and cuts in programs that that worker will depend upon. That worker may need food stamps, it will be cut. That worker, when he or she gets old, will be on Social Security. They're going to go after Social Security. They just cut Medicaid by $800 billion over a 10-year period. So I think, it gets back to the argument of whether we can afford to spend a huge amount of money getting involved in wars and adequately take care of working families in this country. So that's a simple, I think, and straightforward explanation.
Is that Colette?
Yes.
Introduce
Hi,
yourself.
Senator Sanders. My name is Colette Pichon Battle. I'm with the U.S. Human Rights Network. Thank you for being here this evening. I come to the human rights work from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil drilling disaster. And one frame that I hear mentioned sort of subtly, but not as in front as I would hope, is the issue of climate change. And I wonder how you see the fight for human rights and the climate reality connected.
Well, if you're talking about the survival of the planet and the lives of billions of people, I guess we're talking about human rights. And if we are talking about the fact that the people most immediately impacted in this country and around the world would be lower income people, you are talking about human rights. I am furious at this fossil fuel industry today that is doing exactly what the tobacco industry did 50 or 60 years ago, and that is that they are lying. You may recall or have read 60 years ago the tobacco industry was telling you how good it was to smoke for your health. Well, what the fossil fuel industry today is denying the reality that the scientific community has almost unanimously come to. Climate change is real. It is caused by human activity, is already doing devastating harm. And the people most impacted will be poor people in this country and poor people around the world. And on top of all of that, if we look at a world of more flooding and more drought and rising sea levels and mass migrations of people to find a place where they could grow their crops or live in a peaceful way, what you're going to see is with that mass migration, more tension developing within the global community and the potential of more wars. So I happen to be, of all of the embarrassments of the Trump administration, the fact that they are rejecting what the scientific community almost unanimously agrees to is really quite pathetic. But the good news is that you're seeing in state after state and around the world a quite rapid movement to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. The price of solar is plummeting. Our job, and I just worked with Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon on legislation, massive investments in sustainable energy and energy efficiency. That's the direction we have to go. It is very much a human rights issue.
Mariam?
Good evening, Senator Sanders. Let me first say that my name is Mariam Khawaja. I'm from Bahrain, and I was one of your many, many supporters internationally when you were running for the election.
Thank you.
But my question to you, and I want to challenge you a little bit on this, I think many of us, your supporters, both in the US and outside, were quite surprised when you signed on to the letter about Israel to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And my question, I guess, is why? I mean, I saw your interview where you made the comparison about Saudi Arabia, which I completely understand, given that I'm from the GCC. But I guess the comparison would be would the same senators, would they have signed on to a letter if it had been about the apartheid government of South Africa? Thank you.
The reason I signed on to this letter, along with every other member of the United States Senate, was simple. I think The thrust of the letter, to my mind, was not to defend Israel. That was what was the media kind of picked up on, or not to suggest that Israel does not have serious human rights violations, but to suggest that if the Human Rights Commission or committee at the UN is going to be honest, maybe you got to take a look at Egypt, where there are tens of thousands of people in jail, many of them being tortured. Or Saudi Arabia, I'm not quite sure in Saudi Arabia if women can drive a car yet. Or in Russia or other countries. So what the thrust of that letter was not per se a defense of Israel or denial of human rights. It was to say, why just Israel? Let's take a look at human rights all over the world, and human rights violations include Israel, but not just Israel. That was it.
Before I call on Rodney, just to say, I think the Human Rights Council, we were very much involved, that you're talking about, in the reform of the Human Rights Council. And I would say that the Human Rights Council is actually much better now, right? Jamil is nodding his head. And I don't think the problem, I think there has been a problem in the past with sort of sole focus on Israel, but that has really changed in the last few years. So I think I would applaud that question in the sense, not to criticize you, Senator Sanders, obviously you're in our house, I won't do that, but to maybe open a discussion about this. There are great resolutions on Egypt. Actually, the Council is quite good on many of these countries where there are problems. So the Council itself is getting stronger, and we should acknowledge that. But Rodney, is that Rodney?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Rodney C. I'm a journalist from Liberia, West Africa. I'd like to speak to something that affects everyone in this room indirectly. The budget for the State Department has been cut drastically, and most human rights organizations in countries like ours benefit from that funding. Mm-hmm. And for me personally, I think about women who are being raped every day in Liberia, and they go unpunished. Victims are being victimized, and they can't speak out because there's no awareness and everything. And I wonder what you, as a senator in the U.S. Senate, can do to advocate for increased funding or
Sure.
stop the funding from going.
Look, understand, as most of you know, the way the budgetary process works in the United States is the president makes a proposal. I think it is fair to say that his proposal, not just in the area of the State Department, but in general, is going to be dead on arrival. And I think you will have people in the military saying that, you know what, from a military perspective, you have got to continue foreign aid, because we don't want to fight terrorists in every country in the world. We want people around the world, in developing countries, to understand that the United States does know that they have problems with hunger, with education, with women's rights. So Trump brought forth his budget. That will not absolutely be the final budget. It will undergo massive changes, and I will do my best to make sure that the State Department and foreign aid are very adequately funded.
Thank you very much.
Nugget.
Senator Sanders, my name is Nikhat. I'm from Pakistan. I'm Muslim, I'm brown, and no Muslim ban could stop me to come here. I'm so glad that you raised an issue of surveillance. It's not happening only in America, but countries like America are setting bad precedents for countries like Pakistan, who always get excused to do mass surveillance. However, I also want to raise the issue of not only the Muslim ban, but also the laptop ban, and I call it Muslim laptop ban.
The what ban?
So
Latino.
laptop, yes. So
Laptop,
so it's not only the
Laptop,
ban.
yeah.
It's the Muslim laptop ban,
Yeah.
because all the people coming from Muslim countries cannot carry their laptops in their in their hand carry luggage. Also asking for their passwords on their regarding their social media accounts at the immigration. All these practices being set by America is setting bad precedents for countries like us, and I would like you to lobby around that the precedents that America is setting are really not good precedents. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your remarks, and I agree. It is why this particular president wants to create a situation where he is giving ammunition to Al-Qaeda and ISIS is beyond my comprehension. Why do you want to show the world that you are at war with Muslims, that you hate Muslims. It is incomprehensible to me. So we are going to do our best to oppose those policies. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, thank God we had some good court decisions coming down that says that we cannot discriminate against people coming into this country based on their religion. All right, maybe just 2 more questions.
There's Andrew Anderson.
Yeah, my name's Andrew Anderson. I work with an organization called Frontline Defenders, but I'd like to ask you about Sudan. One of the last things President Obama did was to ease sanctions on Sudan, which are coming up for review, I think, at the end of May. Sudan continues to wage war on its own people in Darfur, in Blue Nile, in South Kordofan, and the Nuba Mountains. And it continues to jail human rights defenders, including our friend and Frontline Defenders Award winner, Mudawi Ibrahim Adam, who in the last couple of days had the order for his release rescinded. And he remains in prison after 5 months without charge. I'm hoping that you can use your position in the Senate to continue to question the human rights record of Sudan in the context of the review of the sanctions situation there.
Okay. Thank you very much for the work you do, and that's certainly something that we will pursue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe last question.
Okay, Nandi.
Hi, Senator Sanders. It is a pleasure to speak with you. My name is Nandi Vanka, and I work here in the Carter Center's Democracy Program on our Human Rights House project for the Congo. I should say the human rights struggle in the Congo, not the project. And I would just like to recognize, and it's a pleasure to get to ask you this because you're in such a position of power as an ally on the Hill. I think we can all recognize that as democracy in the U.S. is threatened, we sort of see it echo around the world. This is something we've been talking about all throughout this forum. And so particularly in the U.S., as democracy is compromised, as it deteriorates, you see that women and girls, and especially women and girls of color, feel it most strikingly. That health rights, economic rights, in every facet of life, women and girls of color are really suffering as democracy deteriorates. So I'd like to ask you how, in your position of power in the Senate,
I wish I was
can
quite as powerful as you think I was.
I mean, you
If I
have
was,
a-
this country would not be quite in the straits that it's
Let's
in,
put
but-
it this way. I read everything you post on Facebook.
Okay.
All of my friends do. When you say something, people think about it, and they really
That's
prioritize it.
Thank you. That makes me very happy. I mean,
Yeah, they really do, and they talk about it because
Good.
you're talking about it. And so I would like to appeal to you and ask how we can prioritize rights for women and girls of color in the U.S.
What is going on now, and again, it is so important that we not allow ourselves to accept this as normal, all right? Right now, as you know, in the health bill that was passed on Thursday in the House, they want to defund Planned Parenthood, taking away the choice of 2.5 million women. Trump just announced that he's going to be thinking about aid to historically black colleges and universities. Do you know that? They're going to try to, we don't know what the repercussions are, but he thinks that that kind of funding may be unconstitutional. We have Jeff Sessions as our Attorney General, who thinks that maybe we haven't been aggressive enough on the war on drugs, which has been devastating to minority communities all over this country. So you're quite right. I mean, and not to mention that there is a war against women's right to control their own bodies. There will be cutbacks if Trump has his way, and we're going to do everything we can stop him. There have been, and many of you are part of organizations that are doing your best to protect girls of color around the world so they get good educations, right? So they can go out and find jobs in a non-discriminatory environment. And they want to cut back on those things. So we are in a war on all of those issues. And we need to rally the American people. I certainly will do everything that I can to fight for those enormously important issues. And I'll tell you, we can go on and on and on, but just all of you know in this room, and those of you who are not from the United States know something about American history. You know about the struggles. I was just talking to President Carter. In his youth, what the South was about in this country, segregated society. We have struggled for so many years, and so many people have went to jail, and some have died to try to end this racism, to end the sexism, right? Think about the struggle of the women's movement. 100 years ago, women didn't have the right to vote. I remember it was a big, big deal when I was mayor of Burlington. We appointed the first woman police officer. Oh, wow, what a big deal, all right? So we have made progress, and now you have a president who wants to rescind and overturn so much of what has been done in this country and around the world. And we have got to stand united and say, sorry, Mr. President, you are not going to get away with that. That's it. So, with that, good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Oops. Matt.